Good morning, everyone in Business Law 1. Hey, we're at that transition point. We're going to go into Chapter 5, which is contracts. It's the heart and soul of business law. Some could argue that business organizations is just as important, but to me, when I think of Business Law 1, I think right away contracts, contracts, contracts. And Chapter 5 is that transition, talking about what is a contract and how we describe different kinds of contracts or the classification of contracts. Some of you will really find this as a turning point, hopefully an enjoyable one. But let's begin. This will be a bit long for me, and well, everything's long for me, I know, because I talk too much. But I do want you to get the sense that Chapter 5 gets built out from Chapter 6, Chapter 7, Chapter 8, Chapter 9. They're all building upon the concepts that we find in Chapter 5. Chapter 5 just is trying to introduce you to the concepts. In the later chapters, we'll try to fill it in and give it more meaning and context for application purposes. So Chapter 5, contract, basically identified legally enforceable agreement between two or more parties. It's kind of obvious. But the difference, the distinction I really want to make clear is every contract is an agreement, but every agreement is not a contract. What really makes it different, we can agree on all kinds of things. I always use like, some kind of an example about how can you distinguish between the two is I often get invited to social functions with friends and things to do different events. And I'll be quite honest, I hate going to them. Some people think I'm antisocial. I don't think I'm antisocial as much as I am, well, maybe I'm antisocial. But the point is I get invited to these things, and sometimes my friends know I'm notorious for not showing up. So they'll say, Jim, I really want you to know, are you going to come? Because we're buying food and, we got to get a head count and all that kind of stuff. And I say, yeah, and I do usually have good intent. I say, yeah, I'm going to come. And then a time comes around for the date of whatever it is, the barbecue or some event, and I don't go. And my friends get outraged. Now, did I breach a contract? So I'm going to say, well, yeah, you did, because they did an expenditure with the expectation you would go. That's not true. In fact, if you watch a lot of, I don't call them news shows, but there's a lot of TV's changed a lot in the past, certainly 10 years. But there was things like Good Morning America and other shows like that were really popular in the country. Maybe they still are. I don't know. I've even given up cable myself, and I just use the internet for movies and things like that. But I always remember, I think it was Good Morning America, there was a show where a bride and her husband invited so many people with RSVPs, tell me you're coming or not. And they spent out, I don't know, $100 per guest in the food, and the facilities cost money. And they decided to sue the guests that didn't show up without just cause, without an excuse. And in the Good Morning America made a big sensational story out of it. And they were debating about whether or not this was viable or not viable. In the long and short of it, it's not viable. It wouldn't be a valid breach of contract, because in order for it to be a contract, it's going to have to meet the elements that we're going to go over, not only in this chapter, but again in the chapters that follow it. But there also has to be an expectation of all parties involved to be legally bound. And it's not reasonable to believe that people invited to a social event, even though the money is going to be spent as a result of that invitation, and there's a foreseeable expectation that money will be wasted, for lack of a better way of saying it, if you don't show up. The last one I blew off was, although I've seen them in concert many times, many of you don't know who they are, but one of their band members died fairly recently, and ZZ Top. And so a friend of mine got tickets to meet me at the place, the ZZ Top's playing, and of course I didn't show up. And he says, now I've lost that money. So, well, he would have lost the money anyways if I showed up, because it was going to be a gift. That's a whole separate issue. We'll actually get into gifting in a later chapter. But the point is, there was no expectation to be legally bound. So outside of that, what's a contract? A legally enforceable agreement between two or more parties. Very straightforward. Everything's open book, open test, open internet, open resources for the exam anyways. You should know that one. But now the book does a nice job. It's on page 49. It gives you the elements of any contractual analysis. First, it must be a mutual agreement. That's chapter 6. Offer and acceptance. They have to mirror each other. They have to be identical. We'll get into that later. I'm already 5 minutes into this thing. I really haven't said much substantively. So mutual agreement between the parties. That's the heart and soul of the contract, is the essence of the bargain. What are the parties agreeing to? Offer and acceptance. Part 2, it must be with this doesn't have to be in order. The book goes in order about capacity and competency. They're very much interrelated. Capacity sometimes relates to things like, does the person have the authority to enter into a contract, maybe on behalf of a corporation or on behalf of a trust, or on behalf of themselves because of age or other infirmities with regard to mental capacity. The The other one is competency, which is all about mental wherewithal to voluntarily execute an agreement. You have to have enough understanding to enter in a contract, which is a very low threshold. Competencies presumed at law, like presumption of innocence in a criminal case. Another presumption of law is the presumption of competency. We presume people who are over the age of 18 are competent mentally to enter into a contract. So someone saying that contract shouldn't be enforceable because the person's not competent, they would have the burden to prove lack of mental competence. And it's usually done through doctors and things like that. It's a very difficult burden to overcome. So capacity and competency, very interrelated, sometimes used synonymously. They're not synonymous, they're slightly different, but long as for this class, you know that the parties have to have either capacity or competency. Sometimes it makes the contract void, meaning not good at all. Sometimes it makes it what we call voidable, meaning it's good at its threshold, but the person that lacks competency or capacity might have the ability to rescind its enforceability against them. Get to that in a later chapter. It's chapter 7. Third, it has to be supported by consideration. And this isn't consideration meaning thoughtfulness or kindness or decency or civility in the process. When we talk about consideration, we're talking about something has to be exchanged between the parties. Classically, it's money for this iPhone. Money would be part of the consideration. The iPhone would be the other consideration. Something's exchanged. In Latin, it's called quid pro quo. You probably heard that term before. Something's exchanged back and forth. So someone promises me to give me their car. Just, hey, my friend's very wealthy. He's getting a new car. He doesn't really want to trade his old one in. He knows I need another car because I have all these kids that are driving now, and they're quickly bankrupting me. So he says, Jim, I'm going to give you my car. Is there a contract? No, because what am I giving him in exchange? Nothing. If I said, great, hey, I know you put a lot of maintenance into it. I know you have some value, and you could probably get $5,000 in trade. I'm going to give you $1,000 for it, just out of goodwill. Now we might have a valid contract because something's being exchanged, the car for the money. Don't think so narrowly that it has to be always money for a good. It can be services for services. You paint my house, I'll represent you in court for your divorce, something like that. It can be exchange of services. Something where the parties have to change their position. We call it legal detriment. They change their position in some way legally is enough to valid consideration flowing back and forth. And we're going to get into chapter 8 talks all about consideration. And some things might surprise you what would not be consideration. And it also has to be valid consideration. It can't be things like, I'm going to hire you to beat up my neighbor who's playing loud music at night. That, even though there's something being exchanged, I'm going to pay you money and you're going to do a service for me, beat up my neighbor. It has to be for a legal purpose, and that gives you number 4. It has to be for lawful purpose. Now, the easy example is obviously if we're contracting over something that's criminal, that's easy, but not everything that's illegal is criminal. Some things that are illegal are simply like, I'm going to hire you to sell my house. You do so, but you're not a licensed realtor. That is not a criminal behavior. It's not even immoral, but is it illegal? Yeah, it is. And so therefore the contract wouldn't be enforceable. And then the fifth one, this is the one that really surprises everyone. The fifth sort of rubric, if you want to call it, I didn't know what a rubric was until I guess in college, professors say, I'm going to hand out a rubric. That would always scare me because I always picture a Rubik's Cube thing or something. Rubric, a way of measuring whether or not we have validity in contract. These are the 5 elements. And the fifth one is form. So I always thought contracts would have to be in writing. In fact, when I was in law school, there was a place in Worcester that I was visiting. I was visiting Worcester for some reason. There was a place called Paulson's. Now it's gone. I don't know what it is now. But Paulson's was a stationery store like Staples to sell a lot of pre-printed forms and letterhead and all kinds of stuff like that. And they had pre-printed contracts, meaning it would say contract at the top and it would have it written in like nice, I don't know what you call it, Gothic font or something like that. It looked very professional. And it would say, I blank enter into the following contract this blank date with the other party, part B, and then it would have a section where you would fill in the details about what the parties are bound to, and there'd be a section about damages and things like that later on. I always thought contracts had to be in these kind of fancy forms. In fact, when I first got to law school, which I should have known better because I went to law school when I graduated, that I should have known better that it didn't have to be in any kind of special paper, but I actually bought a ream of legal size paper, which is the 11.5 by 17. It's a little bit longer than your traditional print paper that you use in your home printers and school printers, and most documents are printed on. thinking that it have some kind of bearing on documents that you should have. And you can use those kinds of things, but you don't have to. In fact, the thing that's going to surprise most of you, contracts don't have to be, in most circumstances, in written form. But the fifth element, at least you have to explore it, because some contracts must be in writing to be enforceable. Doesn't mean the parties can't go forward without a writing, but if at some point one party says, I'm not going to go forward, the question is, hey, if we sue that other party, do we have to have a writing, or could it just be oral? You're going to find through the course that most contracts can be oral. It's just a handful that can't. I'll just introduce them real quick. It's an acronym that another attorney that teaches business law out in the Midwest came up with, MyLegs. But there are many other contracts between these, but these are the big ones. Contracts for marriage, like prenuptial agreements, divorce settlements, they have to be in writing to be enforceable. The next one in MyLegs, the acronym M, marriage. Y is contracts that by a year or more by their very nature. I'm hiring you for 2 years to play baseball for the Red Sox. That contract would have to be in writing because by its very terms, it has to be more than 1 year. The next one, MyLegs, L is the next letter, and that would be land. Contracts for an interest in real estate, in order to be enforceable, must be in writing. The next one is E. That's an executor. Somebody dies, and then they name, usually a loved one, family member. It could be an attorney. It could be anybody, really. Executor to manage the dead person's estate, make sure the property goes to the right people after they die, and the last expenses of their health needs were paid for and things like that. Sometimes they make promises to people to pay certain debts and to transfer certain things with regard to the decedent's estate. Those contracts have to be in writing to be enforceable. And then the big one in the MyLegs acronym would be G, goods over $500. Now, many people say, well, wait a minute, I bought a snowblower. This is an example I use. I bought a snowblower a few years ago. I never had a snowblower as a kid growing up. I went through the blizzard of '78. I was a little kid at the time. But I remember my dad and I shoveling snow for years. And I used to think we were pretty middle class. We were probably pretty poor. But because I remember shoveling, and we never had snow shovels. We had coal shovels and the spade shovels that would dig into the dirt. It was really difficult to make any progress. And all of our neighbors had snowblowers. And I always said to myself, when my father was still alive, I bought a snowblower, and I remember telling him how I almost started weeping when I bought it because it was such a meaningful moment for me to have a snowblower. But I think it cost like $1,200. It had like hand warmers and headlights and all kinds of nice little things on it. It was very powerful. When I bought that, I paid cash, and they literally put it on the back of my truck on a ramp, and they rolled it up. Did I write up a contract? Well, I just said contracts for goods over 500 have to be in writing. No, I didn't. We only care about the writing if one party decides not to perform. There they delivered the goods, I gave them the money, so the contract's completed, it's executed. It didn't matter if there was a writing. It's only when it's in that stage where it hasn't yet performed that we care that there's a writing, so we can use it to enforce it in court if we had to. So, and the next one, it's kind of obscure, so that's goods over 500. And the last one in terms of the big nuggets, there's a couple others that statutes in different states may say that in order for this kind of contract to be enforceable, it needs to be in writing. The next one is called a suretyship, being responsible for somebody else's debt where you don't get any benefit from it. So say I have a business associate, they supply goods to my store, and they said, hey, I need some more of those goods. And they say, well, we can't manufacture anymore because we're behind on our supply of raw materials, and they won't give us anymore because we're behind on our payment with them. If I called up that supply company and says, look, I'll guarantee payment for this Acme company because I need to work with them and I need to get a shipment out, I'll guarantee payment if they don't pay it within the next 6 months. I don't get any direct benefit from that promise to pay somebody else's debt. Because I don't get a direct benefit, the law says in order to become responsible for somebody else's debt, it has to be reduced to writing. That's all. So, hey, maybe that's all. Chapter 49 is the rubric. Most of you can say, well, that's great, but what does that actually mean? What does a mutual meeting of the minds mean? What does consideration actually mean? Give me some examples. What does competency and capacity mean? What is lawful purpose? Can you give me some examples where it wouldn't be valid? And then, again, when do we have to have a writing? When can it be just oral? And then the thing's going to really surprise people. When can it be just implied? Well, yeah, a lot of contracts are just implied by law. Can't help but get into it. I know I go too long, but think about it. When I used to go to Dunkin' Donuts every single day back in the day when I drive to the Mount, I had a regular schedule Monday through Friday, and it was in Rutland, Mass. And I drive up through Sturbridge and I get to Rutland, and it just creature of habit. I'd stop at this, I think it was called the Four Corners Convenience, and I'd stop in, and I always get a medium black coffee, just a pattern I had all the time. And guess what happened after a while? Well, they just see me and I'd see them and I'd kind of nod and they kind of nod. And next thing you know, there was a medium black coffee. That's back when coffee was, I don't know, $1.75 and I'd always leave at $2 and I'd walk out. Well, after a while, years would go by. After a while, what if one day they pour the cup of coffee and they put it on this and I walk away? Could they, in theory, sue me for breach of contract? In theory, they could, because it was implied by my pattern of behavior over a long period of time that when I walked in the store, I expected a medium black coffee. I mean, no one's going to sue over a $2 cup of coffee, but you get my drift that sometimes large businesses do business in a pattern of behavior over time that will say that their conduct was implicit, and they may have an enforceable contract, sometimes for big money. So we'll talk about that later. So classification of contracts, that's a very important thing on page 50. You don't need to know them in terms of being able to describe in every circumstance whether it meets one of these definitional terms. But over time, you got to get comfortable with these terms. Contracts, we already talked about. Types of contracts, void. It's never been good. It's an illegal contract or it's void against public policy. It's void. It can't be enforceable. It's no good. It's bad. Voidable is that the contract is currently good, but because of some defect in either the intent of the parties or there was fraud, duress, which we'll cover in a later chapter, one of the parties, the victim of either the lack of capacity or the fraud or the mistake of material fact, might have the ability to avoid the contract. So the contract's good, it's valid, until one or two of the parties can walk away from it. I think of kids. A lot of people are surprised by this. Kids actually have the power to enter into a valid contract. So that's another term you need, valid, but it could be voidable. Why? Because they're kids. We don't want kids to be bound by an agreement that might not be too swift. If their parents get a hold of it and says, I can't believe you bought, I don't know, something ridiculous. And the kid, believe it or not, has a right to avoid most contracts through avoidance, basically return whatever goods they have and get all their money back. And even if the sign says, all sales final, doesn't matter. Kids lack capacity. Doesn't make the contract void. It makes it what? Voidable. At some point, the contract will lose its voidability when the child turns 18 in most states. So we have contracts, void, voidable. Now the next are express and implied, and I already alluded to that. Express are, we're going to overtly state, either in writing or orally, what each party is obligated to do. That's an express contract. It's expressly stated. Implied is, just like I said before, by behaviors. The old saying, actions speak louder than words. You may have an implied contract. A lot of times it's a hybrid, meaning that the core parts of the contract are express, but some of the details are implicit. I can't think of an example off the top of my head. I agree to paint your house for $5,000, really big house. You want 2 coats of paint, and we expressly state the kind of paint. That's 2 coats and things of that nature. What's implied, if we don't speak about it any other word, that the painter is going to supply the ladders and the paintbrushes and the turpentine or the solvents to clean the paintbrush and things like that, because that's the custom in the industry. That's how we determine what implications mean, is custom oftentimes. So you need to know these terms, express and implied. Formal versus simple. I'm going to give you an easy one right here. All we're dealing with are simple contracts. It doesn't mean they're not complex. Formal means that there are certain contracts under law that are recognized with certain formalities, like recognizances from court, bonds and indentures. Certain kinds of contract of insurance are considered formal contracts. Let me see if they give some other examples of formal contracts. Contracts under seal, which just means the statute of limitations goes out to 20 years as opposed to 7 years on most contracts. You don't need to know that, but that's my point. You don't need to know about formal contracts because they're pretty rare. We don't deal with formal contracts that often. I'm looking to see if there's some other things on formal. Negotiable instruments are formal contracts. Those of you who take business law too. Some of you might have already done that. Checks are a type of formal contract, believe it or not, because it's a third party through a financial institution, requires payment. Those are types of formal contracts. But the rest are all simple. I hate the word simple because it makes it like it can be small. It can be huge, it can be multi-million, it can be $1 billion contract. Still probably a simple contract. Now, this is a big one. It gets people confused. Executory versus executed. Fancy words, and it throws people off in law. That's part of law is vocabulary. And like anything else, it can be very intimidating if you're studying a foreign language. It's like, oh my God, I'm lost. relax. All executed means is we're done. The contract's completed. There may be certain limitations now to undo it. We're more likely to stop the enforcement of an unfinished contracts than we are to unravel, which is called rescinding a contract. It's already been completed. So remember the time I bought that snowblower for cash? They gave me the snowblowers, the keys, they got the cash. It's over. That's an executed contract. The question is, can I undo it later? Maybe for breach of warranty or something. We're not going to cover that today. I just want you to know, executed means it's done. Both parties have performed what they're supposed to do. Executory means one or both parties have yet to perform. Go back to house painting. When you first meet with the house painter, I used to paint for a living with my buddy who just died, actually, much older than I was. I was 18, and he was in his 40s. And we had some fun painting houses, and I learned how to paint. I didn't think there was much behind it until I actually went and painted, because there's actually a fair amount of things you need to know to do it right. But we would go, and I followed him around, and we'd go and meet with the homeowner, not the day we painted, but, hey, we got some time coming up. Homeowner wants a house painted. We go up and talk to them about what they wanted. And my buddy was not a lawyer, but he was pretty skilled at writing contracts, spell out all the different details in it. All right, we leave, and we'd actually do a written contract. He got in the habit of doing that because of some bad experiences with homeowners in the past. So he'd write out the contract. And on that day when we left, is it an executed contract? No, because the homeowner would give us sometimes a down payment, help us buy supplies and things like that, and show that their intent was to go forward. And we obviously didn't start painting yet. So it was executory on both sides. Both sides had yet to execute their end of the bargain. Most service contracts have a point in the contractual arrangements where it is executory. Think about being a lawyer, for example. Almost all my contracts, when they first start, we have a binding agreement today. Gave me a deposit, which we call a retainer. You give me a retainer. I agree to do the work. We have a binding contract. It's not completed yet. You probably still owe me more money upon doing a certain amount of work, and I owe you the services. I owe you to go out and represent you in your OUI, or whatever it is I'm representing you on. So executed versus executory. I'm sorry they use fancy word. I don't know why they say finished versus unfinished. That's what they mean. And why do we care? We're going to learn later the rules are different about whether or not the parties actually have the ability to maybe get out of a contract. Whether it's executed or whether it's executory might make a big difference. And the next one is unilateral, another fancy sounding word, and bilateral. Most contracts are bilateral. I agree to paint your house in exchange for giving you money. Both sides are making promises. Most are bilateral, like bicycle, two wheels. Unilateral, like a unicycle, one wheel, is a one-sided promise, and they can be enforceable. Those are usually related to things like rewards, like things like lost dog. Both my dogs are sleeping over here, and everyone always wants to see my dogs. There's the new puppy who's now 10 weeks old, and my 5-year-old Golden, and they're not related, but they're behaving nicely. Usually they just wrestle and fight and bite all the time. But now, what was my point with that in terms of unilateral? So the dog is missing. That'd be heartbreaking, but we put up signs, $50 reward. No one comes and knocks on my door and says, I agree, I promise you I'll find your dog, and therefore enters into a bilateral contract. It'd be unilateral, meaning that I made the promise, and the only way in which the contract becomes consummated or completed is you just simply perform, you do it. Road races. I have a friend of mine who's a big runner, and there's prize money, and she runs these big races. Man, she's fast too, and she's a long distance runner, and she's won money. But in order to win, she doesn't go up to the person and go, okay, first place is 5,000, second place is 3,000, third place is 2,000, fourth place is $750, and then there's some lesser prizes all the way through the top 10 finishers. She doesn't go up to the sponsor and say, I agree to come in seventh. I will now take the $350. No, she has to come in seventh. She has to do it. She has performance. Acceptance is by performance. It's a unilateral contract. Kind of common sense. So most contracts can do it bilateral. So I think we're going over those. Maybe I'll be a little quicker today than I thought I would. Oh, no. Of course, I went through the part. No, there's a thing I haven't talked about. It's called quasi-contract, or sometimes kind of unjust enrichment. Quasi means in a like form, like the breakfast my wife made me today was a quasi breakfast because it was quasi edible. That's a joke. She actually didn't make me breakfast. it's unjust enrichment. There are several terms for this kind of quasi-contract. It's like a contract. It is not a contract because it doesn't meet one of the 5 elements, but we're going to make the parties obliged to a certain degree of liability. Sometimes it's also called quantum meruit is related to it. That's a Latin term, like justice requires it to be some kind of payment. I always use different examples in this, like say a guy comes out and the markings on our houses have just been updated by the fire department, but say the mailboxes aren't clear in terms of the numbers, and all of a sudden I see a lawn mowing crew coming out and doing my property, and they see me and I see them, and they're taking the lawn mower, the big, Gravely lawnmowers out that you walk or ride behind by standing, and they got weed whackers. There's a whole crew going all over my property. I see them. I don't object. I don't say anything. And then when they're done, I'm like, hey, thanks for doing my lawn. And they say, yeah, give me $500 or whatever it costs to do a lawn like mine. I said, I never hired you guys. We don't have a contract. We don't have a mutual meeting of the minds. We don't have an offer and acceptance. They said, but you saw us. You didn't say anything. He goes, yeah, you wanted the next house over. What, I see their addresses. Oh, yeah, you're 292. This is 294. You're at the wrong address. But because I saw them doing it, I didn't stop them from doing it. I knew they were mistaken. Should the law impose an obligation upon me to pay them fair market value for what they did? Yes, and that's just like it sounds, unjust enrichment. I've been unjustly enriched by the circumstance. I should pay something. Might not be the contract price, however. What if they're really expensive and they kind of, uppity sort of lawn care service? I have to pay what the reasonable value would be for what I've received. This happened, I always think of my dad, experience I had as a kid. I can remember they brought shrimp cocktail. I didn't like it as a kid, but I do now. But when I was a kid, they brought shrimp cocktail to my mother and father. And we almost never went out to eat. That was like another reason why I've come to realize later on when I was a kid, we weren't so well off because going out to eat was a real luxury. But we're at this fancy place for some reason. I think it was my sister graduated from high school and we went out to dinner. And it was a big, beautiful, shrimp cocktails came. And my father says, oh, they must be free or something. Well, they're not free. We got to bill my father. I didn't order those. I'm not paying for them. The restaurant was nice enough to take it off his bill. He didn't have to pay for it. But think about it. If you didn't order shrimp cocktail and somebody puts shrimp cocktail in front of you and you eat it, shouldn't there be an expectation that you've been unrichly enhanced, if you will, at the detriment of the other party? Now, the courts don't always enforce it, though, because it has to be reasonable. And the last test in it, the last question is, justice really requires you to pay for it. The other one I'm thinking, and this actually happened to a friend of mine, there's a trash service. A lot of us, we do have municipal pickup where I live now, but in the other town I had, there's not municipal service. You have to go to either hire a private company to come pick up your trash, or you have to go down to we call it the transfer station. And we have bags that's got the town seal in it. We pay $1 each for, and we go down there on the Saturday or whatever days it's open and get rid of our trash and do recycling. Well, for a while, they were doing, it wasn't me. Well, I was living there, but a friend of mine, they had, this isn't great. We thought it was town trash. We thought it was a company that the town had privately hired, and must have got it for 6 months. And finally, a guy knocks on the door and goes, hey, we're going to have to cut off service. You haven't paid in the past 6 months. And let's just say, Smitty's Trash Service. We say, we don't have an agreement with Smitty's Trash Service. He goes, well, the previous homeowners did, and I don't know, no one else told us to stop. We didn't know this property got transferred. Did we receive a benefit? They took our trash and they removed it. Did justice really require we give them some compensation? Well, they've certainly provided a service for us that we benefited from. Should we pay a reasonable amount of money in terms of that? Yes. That's called unjust enrichment. And there's multitude. In fact, that's the wild card in contract law. Sometimes we say, we can't meet the mutual meeting of the minds. We're having a problem meeting all the elements of the rubric, if you will, for whether or not there's a valid contract or not. Maybe we can throw out the argument of unjust enrichment or quantum meruit, even though the book never used the word quantum meruit, which surprises me. Well, I'm glad, because it shouldn't use too much Latin anyways. But has the other party been unjustly enriched from our clients, services or goods being transferred to the other party in some way? If so, they should pay something. Don't lose your mind over business law. There's some common sense involved here, and that is the common sense aspect of it when it comes to unjust enrichment, which is a type of quasi-contract or implied in fact contract. I think of the other one where kind of bad accident not too far from here. When I was a kid at a telephone pole, and I got knocked out, and so they take me by ambulance, and I'm too, and I got a hospital bill. Am I going to wake up in the morning and say, "Hey, I'm not paying a hospital. I never agreed with the hospital. I never voluntarily entered here. I can't believe they put bandages on my head, and whatever they did because I was unconscious for a little bit. I was actually got conscious in the ambulance. But you see, my point is that would be a concept of implied contract. There's an expectation, and I shouldn't use the word implied because I don't like that, because implied contracts are more about behavior, but it's a quasi contract. It's unjust enrichment and receiving of the benefit of the other expense. And justice really requires some form of payment. And this is where you have to do some case problems and chapter questions. I did go through this much faster than I thought I would. Very important chapter. You want to know every chapter. Chapter 5, you really want to know. I'm test heavy on chapter 5. So again, don't be afraid to reach out, ask questions, make comment if you want. Hey, the videos are way too short. Or can you throw up something better? I don't know. And don't be afraid to. There's no such thing as a dumb question, and I really do mean that. Otherwise, be well.